At 9:42 on the morning of June 26, 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was a dead man. He just didn't know it yet. He was floating at 18,000 feet above the freezing gray waters of the English Channel, trapped inside a burning metal cage. The cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt was filled with white, acrid smoke. It swirled around his head like a suffocating blanket. It smelled of burning rubber, melting plastic, and the sickening sweet scent of high-octane aviation fuel. Suddenly, a high-pressure hydraulic line, severed by German shrapnel, began spraying hot fluid directly into his face. It coated his goggles in a thick, red film. It seeped into his oxygen mask, burning his eyes like acid, choking his lungs with chemical fumes. He tried to wipe the fluid away with his heavy leather glove, swiping frantically at his face. But it was useless. The oil just smeared across the glass, turning his world into a blurry, opaque, red nightmare. He was flying blind. He couldn't see his altimeter to know how fast he was falling. He couldn't see his airspeed indicator to know if his wings were about to rip off. And worst of all, he couldn't see the killer sitting exactly 50 yards behind his tail, a German Focke-Wulf 190. The pilot was not an amateur. He was an ace, a predator of the skies, who had spotted Johnson's crippled plane and moved in for the execution. Johnson felt the impacts before he heard them. 3 20mm cannon shells slammed into the armor plate behind his seat. Thud, thud, thud. The impact was so violent his teeth rattled in his skull. The steel plate, a slab of hardened metal only a few inches thick, was the only thing stopping the explosive shells from tearing his spine apart. Johnson grabbed the canopy release handle with a desperate grip. He needed to bail out. Now, he yanked the handle with both hands, bracing his feet against the rudder pedals for leverage. Nothing happened. He pulled again, screaming into his oxygen mask, his veins bulging with effort. The canopy didn't budge. The German shells had twisted the fuselage frame, bending the metal tracks. The sliding mechanism was fused shut. He was trapped in a burning plane, blind, falling out of the sky, with a German executioner reloading his guns right behind him to finish the job. The British Royal Air Force pilots had warned him about this. Months ago, the RAF veterans had looked at Johnson's massive, heavy plane and laughed. They touched the fuselage and shook their heads. They said, "It's a coffin, Yank. It's a flying bathtub. It's too heavy to turn, too heavy to climb, and too big to miss. It will never survive against the Luftwaffe." As Johnson huddled in his seat, waiting for the final explosion that would vaporize him, he realized with a sinking heart that they were right. This was the end. But to understand why Robert S. Johnson was still alive 10 seconds later, and why this story would become a legend, we have to go back. We have to leave the burning cockpit and go back 2 years, to a dusty drafting table in Farmingdale, New York. It was 1941. The world was on fire. In Europe, the Nazis were dominating the skies. Their Messerschmitts and the terrifying new Focke-Wulfs were shredding Allied planes with ease. The U.S. Army Air Corps realized they were behind. They didn't just need a new fighter plane, they needed a monster. The task fell to a man named Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli was not your typical American engineer. He was a Georgian immigrant, a man who had escaped the Bolshevik Revolution. He was a visionary who didn't believe in compromise. When the Army asked for a high-altitude fighter, Kartveli looked at the delicate, lightweight designs of the era, the Spitfire, the Zero, and he rejected them all. "No," he said, "we will not build a dancer. We will not build a toy made of paper and wood. We will build a hammer. We will build a tank that can fly." Kartveli designed the P-47 Thunderbolt around one single component, the engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. To call it an engine is an understatement. It was an industrial miracle. It had 18 massive cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows. It produced 2,000 horsepower. At a time when most planes struggled to reach 1,000, it was the size of a small car and weighed over 2,000 pounds. It was so powerful that when it started up, the sound waves could actually knock a man over if he stood too close. But a big engine needed a big body to feed this beast at 30,000 feet. Cartveli had to design a massive turbo supercharger system. It was a complex web of ducts and pipes that ran from the engine in the nose, all the way to the tail of the plane, and back again. This ductwork took up a huge amount of space. It forced the fuselage to be wide. It forced the fuselage to be deep. It made the plane look fat. When the first prototype finally rolled out of the hangar, the ground crews went silent. They had never seen a single-engine fighter this big. It was enormous. It stood on landing gear legs that were nearly 4 feet tall. It weighed 13,000 pounds, fully loaded. For comparison, the dreaded Japanese Zero weighed about 5,500 pounds. The Thunderbolt was more than twice as heavy. One test pilot walked around the plane, looked at the massive 13-foot propeller, and asked, "Where is the rest of the fuselage? It looks like a milk jug." Another pilot joked, "It's a dinosaur. It will sink into the asphalt before it ever takes off." But Alexander Cartveli ignored the jokes. He armed the beast with 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 on each wing. These were not toys. When a pilot pulled the trigger, all 8 guns fired simultaneously. The plane pumped out 13 pounds of armor-piercing lead every single second. The recoil was equal to the thrust of a small jet engine. It was a flying battery of artillery. But the question remained, could a plane this heavy actually fight? When the P-47s finally arrived in England in early 1943, the reception was freezing cold. The British RAF pilots were flying the Spitfire, a plane that was elegant, beautiful, and handled like a sports car. When they saw the Americans taxiing in their massive, lumbering Thunderbolts, they started laughing openly. One RAF wing commander stood on the tarmac, smoking his pipe, and pointed at the P-47. He said, "My God, the Americans have brought their bathtubs with them." The nickname stuck instantly. The flying bathtub, the jug, the lead sled. They mocked its turning radius. They mocked its climb rate. The psychological pressure on the American pilots was immense. They were flying a machine that everyone said was a death trap. But the pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, known as the Wolfpack, were determined to prove them wrong. Led by the charismatic Hub Zemke, they developed new tactics. They knew they couldn't turn with the Germans, so they decided to use the one thing the P-47 had in abundance: weight. Weight meant energy. When you point a 13,000-pound object at the ground, gravity takes over. The Wolfpack pilots learned to dive. They learned to slash. They learned to hit and run. Robert S. Johnson was one of these pilots. He was a 22-year-old kid from Lawton, Oklahoma. He wasn't an aristocrat. He was a carpenter's son. He knew how to shoot, and he possessed a stubborn streak a mile wide. When Johnson first climbed into the P-47 cockpit, he was shocked by the size. It felt like sitting on a balcony. Compared to the cramped cockpit of a Spitfire, it felt like a luxury sedan. But Johnson was worried. He knew the enemy he was facing: the German Focke-Wulf 190. German pilots called it the Butcher Bird. It was fast, it was lethal, and it could turn on a dime. Johnson looked at his massive, heavy plane and wondered, how am I supposed to fight a Butcher Bird in a bathtub? His commanding officer gave him the answer that would save his life. "Don't turn with them, Johnson," he said. "Dive. This plane drops like a stone. Gravity is your friend. Use the weight. Hit them at 500 miles per hour, blow them apart, and use the momentum to zoom back up. Never slow down. Speed is life." Johnson memorized the advice. He practiced it, but for the first few months, he saw nothing. He was bored. He was frustrated. He wrote letters home saying he just wanted a chance to prove the plane wasn't a joke. He wanted one kill, just one. On June 26, 1943. He got his wish, and as he stared at the red fluid covering his goggles, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. The mission briefing was standard: escort B-17, flying fortresses to bomb an airfield near Paris. Johnson walked to his plane, tail number 41, 6235. He had painted the name Half Pint on the nose. The ground crew had loaded 3,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. They had filled the tanks with 305 gallons of fuel. The engine start was deafening. Smoke puffed from the exhaust as the 13-foot propeller churned the air. Johnson taxied out. The plane bounced on its heavy shock absorbers. He lined up on the runway, full throttle. The torque of the engine tried to pull the plane to the left. Johnson kicked the right rudder hard to keep it straight. The tail came up. At 100 miles per hour, the 7-ton beast lifted off the ground. Johnson retracted the gear and began the long climb. 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 24,000 feet. The air grew thin and freezing cold. Frost formed on the inside of the canopy. Johnson turned on his heater, but it barely worked. He shivered in his flight jacket. Below him, the English Channel looked like a gray sheet of metal. Ahead lay France. Nazi-occupied territory. Johnson scanned the sky. His neck hurt from constantly twisting, checking his 6. The radio crackled with chatter from other pilots. Everything seemed calm, but it was a trap. The German Luftwaffe radar had tracked them since they crossed the coast. High above them, hiding in the sun, Jagdgeschwader 2 was waiting. The Richthofen Wing, the elite, led by Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland and Egon Mayer. They knew the Americans were escorting bombers. They knew the P-47s were heavy. And they knew how to kill them. Bandits 12 o'clock high. The warning came too late. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s dove out of the sun like hawks attacking chickens. They came down at 450 miles per hour, their cannons flashing. Johnson saw tracers zipping past his wing. He slammed the stick forward. The formation broke apart. It was every man for himself. Johnson picked a target, a Focke-Wulf turning left. He dove after it. The speedometer wound up. 350, 400, 450. The P-47 shuddered as it hit terminal velocity. Johnson lined up the German in his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger. The plane vibrated as the 8 machine guns fired. Tracers reached out, but he missed. The German rolled and vanished into a cloud. Johnson pulled up, gasping for breath against the G-force. He leveled off. He was alone. The bombers were gone. His squadron was gone. He checked his tail. Empty. He relaxed for a split second. That was his mistake. He never saw the yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf climbing up from below. He never saw Egon Mayer lining up the shot. Boom. The world turned white. The first 20mm cannon shell didn't just hit the plane. It felt like it hit Johnson himself. The explosion ripped through the fuselage just inches behind his head. It sounded like a sledgehammer striking a metal trash can, magnified by 1,000 times. Bam! The P-47 lurched violently to the right, as if slapped by an invisible giant. Johnson's head slammed against the thick, bulletproof glass of the canopy. Stars danced in his vision, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the smell. Acrid, choking smoke filled the cockpit instantly, and then came the fluid. Red hydraulic fluid sprayed out like arterial blood. It hit Johnson directly in the face. It burned. Johnson clawed at his face, frantically trying to wipe the oil away with his heavy leather gloves. But it was useless. It just smeared into an opaque, red blur. He was flying a 7-ton fighter plane at 300 miles per hour. He was under attack by the best pilots in the German Luftwaffe, and he was stone blind. "Mayday! Mayday! I'm blind!" He screamed into the radio, his voice cracking with terror. Static. The radio was dead. The shell had cut the transceiver cables. He was screaming into a void. No one could hear him. No one was coming to save him. Johnson felt the heat rising around his legs. Fire! The hydraulic fluid was flammable. If a single spark hit it, the cockpit would turn into a blast furnace. He had to get out. He had to get out now. This was it. The moment every pilot dreaded, bailing out. Johnson knew the procedure by heart. Disconnect the radio cord, unbuckle the harness, slide the canopy back, jump. He fumbled for the canopy release handle. He found it. He yanked it back with all his strength. It didn't move. He pulled again, grunting with effort. Clunk. Metal hitting metal. The canopy slid back about an inch, and then jammed tight. The German shell had twisted the fuselage frame. The sliding tracks were bent. The metal was fused shut. Johnson was trapped. He was locked inside a burning, falling metal box. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his military training. He pounded on the glass with his fists. He kicked it with his boots. He screamed at it. But this wasn't ordinary glass. This was 1.5-inch thick, bullet-resistant glass. It easily stopped the fists of a terrified 23-year-old boy. He wasn't going to bail out. He was going to ride this flying bathtub all the way to the ground. The irony hit him like a punch to the gut. The RAF pilots had called it a bathtub. They had laughed at it. Now, it was going to be his coffin. He slumped back in the seat. Exhausted, the fire was getting hotter. He had one card left to play. Just one. The dive. If he couldn't get out, he had to put the fire out. And he had to escape the German on his tail. The P-47 was heavy. In a climb, weight is bad. In a turn, weight is bad. But in a dive, weight is kinetic energy. Johnson slammed the throttle forward and shoved the stick down hard. The nose of the Thunderbolt dropped toward the ocean. Gravity took hold of the 13,000-pound machine. The engine screamed as the RPMs redlined. 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The wind rushed over the wings with a howl that sounded like a banshee. The sudden rush of air through the cracks in the fuselage had an effect. It sucked the smoke out. The flames around his feet flickered and died, starved of oxygen by the incredible speed. Johnson wiped his goggles one more time. He could see. It was blurry. It was oily. But he could see. The altimeter was unwinding like a clock in a time lapse. 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet. The P-47 was shaking violently. It was approaching the speed of sound. No German plane could follow a P-47 in a power dive. Their lighter airframes would rip apart. Johnson leveled out at 4,000 feet. He checked his tail. Empty. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He had lost them. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's go home." He turned the battered plane toward England. He thought he was safe. Johnson wasn't safe. He was being hunted. High above, Egon Mayer, the German ace, had watched the American dive. He hadn't followed him down. That would be amateur. He knew the heavy P-47 would have to pull out eventually. He just waited. Then, Mayer signaled his wingman. "Attack!" Johnson checked his mirror one more time, and his heart stopped. They weren't gone. 3 Focke-Wulf 190s were lined up behind him, stepped up in altitude like a staircase of death. They were perfectly positioned in his blind spot. They were playing a game. They knew the P-47 was wounded. They knew the pilot was trapped. They were going to take turns using him for target practice. The first Focke-Wulf dove. The German pilot closed to 200 yards. He steadied his aim. Johnson saw the nose of the German plane light up. Rat-tat-tat-tat. Machine gun bullets sprayed the P-47. They sounded like hail hitting a tin roof. They pinged off the metal skin. Then came the cannons. Boom! Boom! Explosive shells hit the tail section. Shrapnel tore through the elevators. The P-47 bucked like a rodeo bull. Johnson fought the stick, trying to jink, trying to skid. But the rudder cable was gone. The pedals went dead under his feet. The first German pilot ran out of energy, pulled up, and circled back. "Your turn," he seemed to say to his wingman. The second German dropped in. This wasn't a dogfight anymore. This was an execution. Johnson huddled as small as he could in the cockpit. He pulled his elbows in. He tucked his head down. He pressed his back hard against the seat. Behind that seat was a slab of armor plate. It was heavy steel. When the engineers designed it, the pilots had complained. "It makes the plane tail heavy," they whined. "Take it out." Alexander Kartveli had refused. He said, "The pilot is the most expensive part of the plane. Keep the plate." Now, that plate was the only thing keeping Robert Johnson alive. The second German opened fire. He was accurate, brutally accurate. Bullets hammered the armor plate directly behind Johnson's spine. Clang, clang, clang. It sounded like a church bell ringing inside a closet. Johnson felt the impacts vibrating through his own skeleton. He shouted out loud, cursing the Germans, cursing the war. "You sons of bitches! You can't kill me!" The big P-47 wallowed through the air. It was absorbing punishment that would have disintegrated a Spitfire. The second German pilot grew frustrated. He had hit the target 50 times. Why was it still flying? He pulled up, his gun smoking, and then came the third one. The boss, Egon Mayer, the ace with the yellow nose. He didn't want to just damage the plane. He wanted to kill the pilot. Egon Mayer was not a spray-and-pray pilot. He was a surgeon, a cold, calculated killer with over 60 confirmed kills to his name. He saw the P-47 absorbing bullets in the fuselage, realizing the armor plate was impenetrable. So, he changed his aim. He drifted his fighter slightly to the right. He wasn't aiming for the plane anymore. He was aiming for the pilot's head. Johnson saw the Focke-Wulf steady itself in his rearview mirror. He saw the nose adjust. He saw the winking lights of the cannons. Boom. Crack. A 20mm shell struck the canopy frame, inches from Johnson's right ear. The explosion blew out the plexiglass side panel. Shrapnel sprayed into the cockpit like a shotgun blast. Blood started to trickle down his face. The wind roared into the open cockpit, deafening him. Another shell hit the instrument panel. Glass shattered. Gauges exploded. The airspeed indicator, the altimeter, all gone in a shower of sparks and glass dust. Johnson flinched, closing his eyes tight, waiting for the bullet that would end it. But the P-47 kept flying. Mayer was confused. He had put explosive shells right into the cockpit area. Why was the American still flying? He checked his ammunition counter. Empty. He had fired all his 20mm cannon shells. He cursed in German, but he wasn't done. He still had 2 machine guns in the nose. If I can't kill the man, Mayer thought, I will kill the machine. Mayer targeted the engine. The P-47 had a massive nose. It was a big target. Mayer held the trigger down. Rat, tat, tat. Hundreds of rounds poured into the Pratt and Whitney engine. Bullets sparked off the cowling. They punched through the metal skin. They hit the cylinders. Any other Allied fighter would have died right then. The Mustang, or the Spitfire, used liquid-cooled engines. If a single bullet hit that radiator, the engine would overheat and seize up in less than 60 seconds. But the P-47 was different. It was air-cooled. It was just big chunks of metal cooled by the wind. You could shoot a cylinder off, and the other 17 cylinders would keep pumping. Johnson's engine was coughing. It was spitting oil. It was shaking the mountings loose. Chug, jug, roar. But it didn't quit. It was angry. It was stubborn. Mayer watched in horror. He had emptied his machine guns now, too. Click, click. Silence. He was out of ammo. He had fired everything he had at this flying bathtub. And the bathtub was still flying. The shooting stopped. The silence was louder than the gunfire. Johnson waited. He expected the German to ram him. He gripped the stick, ready to pull up and crash into the German if he tried it. If I go, Johnson grunted, you're coming with me. But the impact never came. Instead, a shadow fell over his cockpit. Johnson looked to his left, and his jaw dropped. There, floating just 10 feet away, was the Focke-Wulf 190. Yellow nose, black crosses. It was beautiful and terrifying. The German pilot, Egon Mayer, had pulled up alongside him to fly in formation. They were wingtip to wingtip over the English Channel. Johnson could see the rivets on the German plane. He could see Mayer. Mayer was looking at him. He was studying the wreckage. He looked at the shredded tail. He looked at the holes in the fuselage. So many holes it looked like Swiss cheese. And then Egon Mayer did something that Robert Johnson would remember for the rest of his life. He looked Johnson right in the eyes, and he shook his head, slowly. It wasn't mocking. It was disbelief. It was a look that said, I have killed you 5 times. Why won't you fall? The German ace raised his gloved hand. He rocked his wings gently, a universal salute among aviators. It was a gesture of respect. You are unkillable, the gesture said. Then Mayer banked his Focke-Wulf sharply to the left and peeled away. He left Johnson alone. In the sky. The enemy was gone, but the danger wasn't. Johnson was alone. He was at 8,000 feet, and, dropping, the engine was running rough, shaking the entire airframe violently. He had no radio, no instruments, and he was bleeding. Finally, through the haze, he saw a dark line on the horizon. Land. The white cliffs of Dover. He had made it to England, but he wasn't safe yet. He had to land, and he had a serious problem. He had no hydraulics. That meant no flaps to slow down, and no brakes to stop. He was going to have to land a 7-ton metal brick at 150 miles per hour on a short runway. He spotted an emergency airfield near the coast. Manston. It was a wide grass strip. That's it, Johnson thought. That's my only chance. He lined up for the approach. He reached for the landing gear lever. It was floppy, useless. The automatic gear wouldn't come down. He had to use the emergency manual system. He grabbed the hand pump on the floor. He started pumping. It was hard work. The gear was heavy. He pumped until his arm burned. Clunk. One wheel locked. He kept pumping. Sweat pouring down his face. Clunk. The second wheel locked. Or at least, he hoped it did. There were no lights to tell him. Johnson took a deep breath. He cut the throttle. The big P-47 drifted over the fence. It was coming in hot. Too fast. The ground rushed up to meet him. The wheels touched the grass. Screech! A cloud of blue smoke poured from the tires as the heavy fighter slammed into the earth. But Johnson had a problem. A massive problem. Speed. Without flaps to slow down the air. He had touched down at nearly 150 miles per hour. That is landing speed for a jet, not a propeller plane on a grass strip. He stomped on the brake pedals. Nothing. The pedals felt loose. Dead. The hydraulic fluid was gone. He had no brakes. He was sitting in a 13,000-pound metal sled, hurtling toward the end of the runway like a runaway train. At the end of the runway, Johnson saw a line of trees rushing toward him, and beyond that, a steep ravine. Johnson did the only thing he could do. He kicked the left rudder pedal, hoping the cable was still attached. It wasn't, but he managed to use the engine torque. He gunned the throttle for a split second. Roar! The sudden burst of power kicked the tail around. The P-47 began to ground loop. It spun around violently in the grass. Dirt and mud sprayed into the air like a geyser. The landing gear groaned under the incredible side load. The left wingtip dug into the ground, acting like an anchor. The plane spun 180 degrees, then 270 degrees, and finally, with a shudder, it stopped. The engine coughed once, sputtered, and died. The propeller ticked as it began to cool down. Johnson sat there in the sudden silence. It was deafening. His hands were frozen to the stick. He tried to let go, but his fingers were locked in a death grip. He was shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical blow. He heard sirens in the distance. The ambulances were coming to collect what they assumed was a corpse. The ground crews arrived first. They jumped off their jeeps with fire extinguishers, expecting a blazing inferno, but when they got close to the plane, they stopped dead in their tracks. They just stared. They had seen damaged planes before, but they had never, ever seen a fighter plane look like this, and still be in one piece. The tail was practically gone. It was just a skeleton of twisted metal ribs. The fuselage looked like a cheese grater. The crew chief climbed up onto the wing, his face pale. "Lieutenant, can you hear me?" Johnson nodded slowly. He pointed at the canopy. "It's stuck!" he yelled. The crew chief tried to slide it back. It wouldn't budge. "Get the crowbars!" the chief yelled. Two big mechanics climbed up with heavy iron bars. It took them 20 minutes of prying, bending, and cursing to force the canopy open. When they finally ripped the glass back, the smell hit them. Burnt oil, cordite, old sweat, and fresh blood. They helped Johnson out of the cockpit. His flight suit was soaked red with hydraulic fluid, but he stood up. He walked to the edge of the wing and jumped down to the grass. His legs wobbled, and a medic grabbed him. "I'm okay," Johnson said. He wasn't okay, but he needed to see it. He walked around to the back of the plane. He looked at his ship, half pint, and for the first time, he felt a cold chill run down his spine. He shouldn't be alive. Physics said he should be dead. A crowd had gathered. Pilots, mechanics, officers. They formed a silent circle around the plane, whispering. The crew chief took out a piece of white chalk. "I'm going to count them," he said. He started circling the holes with the chalk. 1, 2, 3, 4. He stopped counting the machine gun holes at 200, There were too many. Then, he started counting the big holes, the jagged, gaping tears in the metal made by the German 20mm explosive shells. Usually, 3 of these shells were enough to tear a wing off a Spitfire. The crew chief counted out loud. 10, 11, 12. The crowd went silent. 15, 16. Johnson watched him. 20, 21. 21 cannon shells. The plane had absorbed 21 explosive rounds and hadn't disintegrated. The mechanics found a hole in the propeller blade big enough to put a fist through. They looked at the armor plate behind the seat. There were 3 massive dents in the steel where rounds had hit directly behind Johnson's heart. Alexander Kartvel's design. The heavy, useless weight that everyone complained about had saved his life. An RAF wing commander drove up in a jeep. He was one of the men who had been critical of the P-47 when it first arrived. He walked around the wreckage slowly. He looked at the 21 chalk circles. He walked over to the American. "Lieutenant," he said, "I owe you an apology." Johnson looked up. "Sir?" The officer gestured at the plane. "I said this plane was a bathtub," the officer said quietly. "I said it was too heavy to fly. I was wrong. If you had been flying a Spitfire today, you wouldn't be standing here. You'd be at the bottom of the channel. That isn't a plane. That is a tank. With wings." News of the survival spread like wildfire. Photos of Half Pint were sent to every airbase in England. It was proof. The P-47 wasn't just a machine, it was a shield. Pilots who had complained about the poor climb rate stopped complaining. They realized something that day. You can't kill enemies if you're dead. The P-47 brought you home. Johnson was cleared by the medics. They told him to take a week off. Go to London. Relax. Johnson refused. He looked at his destroyed plane, which was being towed away to the scrap heap. It would never fly again. It had given its life for him, but he was still breathing. "Get me another one," Johnson told his commander. "Sir?" the commander asked. Johnson's eyes were cold, hard. "Get me another P-47, he said. "I have a score to settle." Robert S. Johnson didn't go home. He didn't ask for a desk job. He climbed back into the cockpit of a brand new P-47 Thunderbolt, but he was different now. The naive boy from Oklahoma was gone. That boy had died in the burning cockpit of Half Pint. The man who emerged was a predator. He stopped trying to turn with the Germans. He started using the vertical. He would climb high, up to 30,000 feet, waiting in the sun like a hawk. When he saw a German formation, he would roll over and dive. The heavy P-47 would accelerate to 500 miles per hour in seconds. He would crash down on the enemy from above, fire a devastating burst from his 8 machine guns, blowing them out of the sky before they even knew he was there. Then, he would use that massive momentum to zoom back up into the safety of the clouds. It was called boom and zoom, and Johnson became a master of it. On October 8, 1943, he shot down a Focke-Wulf 190. 2 days later, another one. By the end of the year, he was an ace. He hunted relentlessly. On one mission, he shot down 3 German fighters in a single day. He was unstoppable. By the time his tour of duty ended, Robert S. Johnson had 27 confirmed air-to-air kills. He was the first American pilot in the European theater to break the record of Eddie Rickenbacker, the legendary World War I ace. He had proven that the flying bathtub could kill the butcher birds. But what about the man who let him live? What about Egon Mayer, the German ace who had shaken his head and flown away? Fate has a strange sense of irony. Mayer continued to fly. He continued to lead the Richthofen wing. He reached 102 confirmed kills. But the tide of war was turning. On March 2, 1944, less than a year after he spared Johnson, Mayer took off to intercept an American bomber formation over France. He never returned. His Focke-Wulf 190 was shot down near the town of Montmédy. And who shot him down? A P-47 Thunderbolt, the very same aircraft type he had failed to destroy that day over the channel. The plane he had mocked for being too tough to die had finally claimed him. Johnson survived the war. Mayer did not. It was the ultimate vindication of Alexander Kartvel's engineering philosophy. Build it strong, build it heavy, bring the pilot home. The P-47 Thunderbolt ended the war with a reputation that no other plane could match. It wasn't the prettiest, but it was the workhorse. It carried a bomb load heavier than some twin-engine bombers. It destroyed 86,000 railway cars. It destroyed 9,000 locomotives. It destroyed 6,000 armored vehicles and tanks. It broke the back of the German army in France. But its greatest statistic wasn't how many things it destroyed, it was how many men it saved. The P-47 had the lowest loss rate of any American fighter in the European theater, less than 0.7%. Think about that. Thousands of mothers, wives, and children got their sons, husbands, and fathers back because Alexander Kartveli refused to remove that armor plate, because he refused to make it light, because he built a tank with wings. Robert S. Johnson passed away in 2008 at the age of 88. He lived a long, full life because on that June morning in 1943, his plane refused to give up on him. He often told the story of the German pilot who shook his head. He said it was the moment he realized that in war, even your enemy can respect you if you simply refuse to die. They called it a tub. They called it a jug. They called it a dinosaur. But to the men who flew it, and to the men whose lives it saved, it was simply the unkillable. If you enjoyed this story of the P-47 Thunderbolt and Robert Johnson's impossible survival, please destroy that like button just like Johnson destroyed the Luftwaffe. It helps us dig up more forgotten stories from the archives. And tell us in the comments, if you had to fly one mission in World War II, which plane would you choose? The fast and agile P-51 Mustang, the climbing champion Spitfire, or the heavy indestructible P-47 Thunderbolt? Let the debate begin in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. We'll see you in the next one.